Good day, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the outcomes of the 22nd Conference of the Party of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. My name is Valérie, and I'm the Director of the Executive Certificate and Master's Programs in Environmental Governance at the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies. This webinar has been organized in the framework of our Executive Certificate in Environmental Governance, which is currently recruiting for its 2017 edition. Before I start introducing our panelists, more information about logistics. If you wish to ask a question, you can do it directly using the Zoom chat if you're connected through Zoom. And if you connect through the phone, you can send your questions via email to the email address, which is executive@graduateinstitute.ch. As you know, the COP closed last Friday, but as for many of these international conferences, discussions have been going on over the weekend. So I'm very grateful that the three panelists that we have today who have attended these negotiations have actually agreed to be with us upon such short notice after the end of the negotiations. Before we start with the discussion, let me quickly introduce our panelists. We have Mr. Pascal Delisle, who is joining us from Brussels. Pascal is academic advisor on climate change. Sorry, Pascal, advisor on climate change for the European External Action Service at the European Union. Mr. Mohamed Nasr is joining us from Cairo. Mohamed is Counsellor for the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was one of the members of the Egyptian delegation. He's also an alumni of our Executive Certificate in Environmental Governance. Our third panelist is Mrs. Merlyn van Voore. Unfortunately, we only have the sound. We won't be able to see Merlyn, but she's with us. And she's joining us from the United Nations Environment Program Office in Geneva, where she works as climate change coordinator. I'm talking to you from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and I have the pleasure to be accompanied by Professor Jorge Viñuales, who is a Harold Samuel Professor of Law and Environmental Policy at the University of Cambridge and the academic advisor to our Executive Certificate in Environmental Governance. So let us start with the substance. As a beginning for the discussions, I would be interested to hear from you, Merlyn, Mohamed, and Pascal. If you could just say a few words about the general atmosphere in Marrakech. What did you feel the mood of the negotiator was, especially taking into account the results of the United States election? So Mohamed, if you want to start. Me?
Okay, usually I try to break the ice in negotiations and in this webinars. Well, I think it was very interesting. I think it was what happened in the meeting was as expected by all of us. This comes after Paris. Paris was the peak of a long process of negotiations, and this year was the first year for the implementation. When you start implementing a legal framework, then you have the different interpretations by different parties or groups. So this was reflected, I think, in the course of the 2 weeks that we had. Each group of countries or each country would try to reflect its own assessment and its own understanding of what was the content of the agreement is and how it sees the balances between the different items of the agreement. So I think that was the main thing that we saw in the 2 weeks. Of course, there were other factors to be taken into consideration when we assess the outcomes of Marrakesh. But in general, I think it was up to our expectation or assessment, at least from the Egyptian and African point of view. We were expecting that this kind of progress would be achieved in this COP. So this is my breaking the ice part.
Thank you. Pascal?
Yes, thank you. And I think I agree fully with Mohamed. I think after the breakthrough of Paris and the very strong momentum that we have seen since last December, it was the first rendezvous for implementation and action, as the Moroccan presidency has dubbed it. And I think we were going there in a spirit of cooperation, far from the old spirit of opposition or tough discussion we had until Paris, basically to put flesh on the bones of Paris. And beside the intergovernmental process, also support all the action being made by non-state actors. But I guess we'll come back to that afterwards. So it was both in the process, UNFCCC process, put flesh on the bones, and outside of the process, really be the cheerleaders of a new era for economic, clean and sustainable economy.
So it seems that the US elections results haven't that much influenced the mood. Merlyn, would you agree with that? What is your take on the negotiations period?
Yeah, I would say, Valérie and colleagues who are listening to this webinar, that on Monday, the 7th of November, when proceedings started, everybody was waiting for the next day, which was the 8th of November, when the US presidential elections took place. The difference between Monday and Tuesday, I would sum up as follows. On Tuesday evening, the mood shifted from we have something to celebrate, meaning the early entry into force. We are here to work hard and to collaborate, as Pascal and Mohamed said, and the mood became one of somberness, painful, quiet reflection, a bit of silence, and I would say a lot of moments of reflection. And you saw that mood throughout the first week and generally to the second week. Thank you, Valérie.
Thank you, Merlyn. Before we get into the outcomes of the COP, Jorge, maybe what was the main aim of this meeting?
It was a rule book, actually, as has been mentioned. In fact, the Paris Agreement is a very short document, and there is, a great need to build upon it and to develop very detailed regulations to implement it. It took 4 years to develop those regulations for Kyoto, and actually they were adopted as a set of decisions of the Conference of the Parties in Marrakesh in 2001. So right now, apparently it's going to take only 3 years. So we have learned in the meantime.
Great. And Pascal, anything you would like to add on the aim of Marrakesh?
Yes, I think it's really that. The aim was both to progress on the rule book. It's absolutely necessary, and we agreed to finalize the rule book by 2018, so well ahead of the official kicking of the Paris Agreement as to these different dispositions. It's very important that all of that is ready before, because it's a lot of details, registries, transparencies, committees, all of that. You cannot invent that overnight, so you have to really develop all these specifics of the Paris Agreement. It was extremely also what we were expecting from Marrakesh is to keep the high-level political momentum. And to connect with your former question on the US election, the Marrakesh declaration at the end of COP kind of confirmed the determination of the parties to continue on addressing climate change in spite of the change of election or of presidency in the US. But of course, a lot of things are not clear yet as to what policy will be led by President-elect Trump. One thing is for sure, the federal government won't be pushing as it used to push, but we also have to remember that for many years, businesses had started to get interested in climate, states, municipalities were also pushing, and the federal government was the last one to kick in and the first one to get out. So we probably will suffer from that to a certain extent, especially as far as the financial contribution of the US to, for instance, the Green Climate Fund. So, but still, I think the Marrakesh Declaration showed that the rest of the world was extremely determined to continue on that. And I think the last objective for us was to celebrate and encourage all the actors, businesses, NGOs, municipalities, who really have taken the lead on climate action. And now we're in a new process where you've got, it's not anymore a COP of governments, it's also a COP of action. It's a new animal that we see emerging, and it will have also implications as to the role of the UNFCCC Secretariat and its budget, how to combine these two processes, the intergovernmental process, which is, of course, the historic responsibility of the Secretariat, but also how to push for action with non-state actors.
So, building on this issue of involving other types of actors further into the implementation, Merlyn, how do you see the role of an organization such as the United Nations Environmental Programme with respect to the Paris Agreement and the follow-up that Marrakesh has put in place?
Yes, the role of UN Environment, particularly with respect to what is called the non-state actor agenda. I'll give an example of what we do there. We have a partnership with Osram and with Philips, which many people know are the lighting companies. And the focus of our partnership there is on phasing out inefficient light bulbs. And so what we do with both of these companies, together with governments and consumers, is to look at which policies do governments need to put in place to make this transition to efficient lighting. We look at how can you change consumer behavior. And then thirdly, together with the companies, and here we are technology neutral, we also try and look at other innovations, not just in the lighting sector, but also in appliances such as air conditioning. And there we also have public-private partnerships. I'm using these examples, Valérie, to show that as UN Environment, our outreach is to engage consumer groups, also private actors, and I've given the example of the lighting, but there are many other such examples. Thank you, Valérie.
Thank you, Merlyn. Mohamed, Pascal mentioned the issue of finance. We all know that this is one that is of importance for developing countries group. Can you say a little bit about what happened in Marrakesh on that issue?
Well, let me start by saying that the issue of like the new stakeholders or the new players coming into climate change is still very challenging for many developing countries, if not all of them. Because simply we have been working, or since the 1992 we had the convention, but on a very clear legal system where governments have responsibilities, and then you have this transparency or accountability process where you can have somebody accountable. Part of what happened in Paris was, as Pascal have said, it's like bringing in the new players, like different actors, be them like national governments, subnational entities, subnational governments, private sector. But the problem is that we face is that there is no accountability process for that. This is all initiatives, and those initiatives fly alone on the side of the legal process that exists. And in doing so, and I think it was part also of the discussions that we had, how can we bring those initiatives that are fly alone on the side into a process where we can quantify them, can have a review them, see their implementation. Because a concern from a developing country, especially who people who work on finance, is that you can have a lot of pledges, but when can you transform the pledge to a real commitment, and then for like make sure it is fulfilled, follow its fulfillment, see the criteria. If this is not in a process that we negotiate and we apply the transparency mechanism that we are implementing or that we are developing under Paris, then the challenge and uncertainty stays there, and the decision maker in many of our countries will go along with the initiative as long as there is a political momentum. But what happens when you have change of governments? So take any initiative. Take the US, for example. The US, everybody was relying that the US is a main player now in climate change, pushing things forward. Part of it, part of the global action. With a change of administration in the US, people were raising questions. So what happens if similar processes materialize in other countries? And we have the Kyoto Protocol, Canada Kyoto Protocol, thing as an example. We had Australia commitments for emission reductions, and then change of government. They went back on the policies. So it's very good to have initiatives, but we have to know that the legal process that is a legal process under a convention or under a legal commitment is the one that counts at the end. We take note of everything. We welcome everything. And I think that was also part of the problem that we had in finance, that we have a lot of initiatives going on, a lot of pledges for those initiatives, but we cannot count them from our point of view. We cannot count them in unless or until they are fulfilled. But we will not just celebrate something that is still virtual for us. On finance, well, I would say that there was nothing that reflects scaling up, but it was more of acknowledgement of what's happening, because there was a roadmap presented by the UK and Australia before. We did not negotiate it. We did not even discuss it under the process, but we took note of it because it highlights some numbers. There was the Standing Committee of Finance report on the flows of finance. So there was more of a celebration of financial flows are going on and they are increasing. But on the other hand, developing countries were saying, yes, we acknowledge that, we respect that, we welcome that with appreciation. But guys, there are a lot of gaps within that, like methodologies that are being applied. How can we apply them? How can we have accessibility? And the issue of accessibility was highlighted in so many places that money might be there, but how to access the finance is the question. I mean, you can have a lot of pledges or a lot of finance somewhere, but what conditionality or what criteria is put for access, then you have like a different ballgame. So I would say on finance, we had business as usual decisions, but in those business as usual decisions, you had 2 or 3 common elements. The first one is that how do you deal with the Paris Agreement as a new legal agreement that is part of the climate mosaic? Where does it fit? Is it on the same level like the convention? Is it under the convention? Is it with the same legal parity or not? How do you reflect that in the text that you're negotiating? And then the second point, so what does Paris says? Paris says new goals somewhere. Okay, how can we reflect that? What kind of methodology are we going to use? So the start of the discussion on all of these issues usually is not easy because you have different starting points from both sides of the table. You have a final goal, or everybody wants is like to achieve financial goals, scaling up and all this stuff. But where do we start? Do we start with, we are scaling up, everything is fine, it's a very rosy picture? Or we start from, well, yes, there is scaling up, but this is way below the needs and what we need to achieve the 1.5 or the 2 degrees. So, I mean, that was across the board, if I would say, with the acknowledgement, of course, of whatever is happening on the side. But those initiatives on the side are very much related to the political support that comes to them. So we don't know how long their lifespans will be. And sorry for talking a lot about finance.
Thank you.
But I love the issue.
Jorge, do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, just one point on what Mohamed was saying. Actually, it's that the pledge is sufficient for branding, but it's not sufficient for effect. And it's the very pledge actually can attract good branding, and there is far less visibility on the non-compliance with that pledge. We have seen that in the Global Compact context, where you had a number of hundreds, even thousands of companies applying and registering for the Global Compact, and fewer at least submitting the required report. So how to address that? I mean, I think that there are 2 or 3 ways. I mean, one way, of course, is this sort of envelope of money that was proposed by Germany and others to enhance transparency, right? That's transparency is good because it shows, it sheds light not only on the pledge, but on whether you had, respected that pledge. So that's one thing that may be potentially interesting. Another thing is, of course, I mean, and that's the approach, the basic approach of the Paris Agreement, is that states in undertaking initiatives for compliance or meeting their commitments it's not a commitment, but I mean, I'm using a word broader than nationally determined contributions, but let's say they're targets to make things simpler. They are supposed to take a number of initiatives, and some of those initiatives could actually bring under a sort of compliance system some of these actors. So that would be really the typical delegation, the main bargain of the Paris Agreement. And the third would be something which is related much more to economics than to law or politics. I mean, the time scale of politics is 4 or 5 years. The time scale of science is probably 100 to 200. The time scale of economics, and I mean investment, is probably 30 years. So many people, I mean, many companies have already made investments. And those investments, I think, are going to be very unprofitable if the move, the general move, is not followed. And I think that, as Pascal was saying earlier in connection with the declaration, and I think that there is broad political support for this broad move, even if the US is not in, which is not that clear yet. But even if the US is not in, part of the US will be in, because the US is a federal system. And in all events, in many parts of the world, the economic sort of signal is moving, and there are many sunk costs already there that will be completely lost if we go back to the prior trajectory of, fossil fuels intensive and so on. So I don't think, I mean, I'm not too legal about this compliance issue. I think that this compliance issue should be much more a matter of ascertaining how much investment is pushing in what direction, including the United States. And once that's more or less clear, even if someone respects or does not respect the pledge, that's less important than how much is at stake economically.
So building upon that, Pascal, maybe, and maybe Merlyn also, let's talk about China. We've heard that China has decided finally to keep the track the way it was said, and was actually really engaging into the discussions. Do you believe that this is because they have made such important investments in the field of renewables and that it's only for economic reasons? Or how would you explain the fact that China, despite the news about the US election, decided it was worth continuing with these discussions?
Well, that's a good question. I think China is a very rational actor, and they are, first of all, pursuing domestic interests. And the domestic interest is really to move away from this heavily polluting economy that is the source of more than 70% of demonstrations in China. So for the stability of the regime, and because they see that a new economy is possible with more innovation, this fossil fuel economy will bring a lot of benefits. China is moving ahead anyway, and it's part of their 5-year plan. So they are now working on they are implementing their new 5-year plan, regardless of what's going on elsewhere. But at the same time, as you said, China and the US made Paris possible. Without one or the other, all what we've seen since 1 year would have never been possible. So for China, they're worried, from what we could gather, discussions with them. Of course, they are worried on the one hand that the US won't be pushing shoulder to shoulder with them. At the same time, you could consider that it's an opportunity for China, because, as I was saying, they will continue their policy anyway. And if on top of that, they can reap the benefits from what will appear as global leadership, it's even better. So I think for China, it's kind of a mixed consequences that US is or may retreat or be at least less active in this process. So China wants to continue. It's a question, they have decided, they are a rational actor, they will continue on this policy. They are interested in boosting cooperation with the EU and with others to continue the momentum. The Chinese have a tendency to look long-term in the interest of their country, and they've decided that the interest of their country was to move away from the current economic model. So they will continue. And ironically, in less than 5 years, they will have gone from global laggard to global leader, maybe a little bit thanks to Mr. Trump.
Thank you, Pascal. Merlyn, would you like to add something on this issue? I mean, what is China as a partner for international organizations such as the United Nations Environment Programme?
Yes, I think Pascal is right that China's main driver for change in the right direction is obviously its domestic issues, and he mentioned pollution being one of its biggest challenges. And so in trying to address pollution, it obviously also addresses the climate question. I also think it's important to note that China has quite a dynamic domestic financial market, which is more and more, certainly we are seeing it as UN Environment, that they are moving in the direction of what we call green finance. So they are moving towards financing environmentally sustainable growth. And this again is linked to their own domestic imperatives. I won't go into detail here, but we, through a number of our colleagues, have worked with Chinese colleagues to look at models for green finance, such as green bonds. And also we are working with Chinese colleagues as part of the Green Finance Study Group, since China, as you know, holds the G20. And all of which is to say, I think that China understands that green growth is the way to go, and it's actually driven by an economic imperative, and ultimately the climate issue is coming from the pressure of its citizens who want to have a healthy environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Merlyn.
I just want to say something, if possible. Well, two things. I believe that the paradigm shift that we all wanted to happen has already happened before Paris, and Paris was like the reflection of the shift, the paradigm shift in the thinking, that the new economic model based on sustainable development in its 3 pillars, but taking the environment into consideration very seriously, has happened already. Part of it was because of the negotiations and the discussion that has been happening all over. It really helped like to have a mindset in the policymakers that this is the path to go. And the second part of it was also that the instruments, the financial instruments, were available. So you had the Green Climate Fund. You had a lot of support bilaterally from developed countries or donor countries to issues that relates to climate change and environment. So it really helped pushing countries. And I would avoid talking about China because China has its own model. I mean, I cannot say China, what happens in China applies in all countries, but the middle income countries, the ones with very high potential and very less resources to achieve this transformational change, has already looked at the GCF and they saw that things are there. That's why I was saying that we welcome the initiatives and they helped a lot into moving things in the right direction. But initiatives relate to political support of whoever is taking them, and we need to take them into the process. So whatever happens in the political scene does not have a negative impact on the environmental scene. Last point is that in many cases, as Pascal has mentioned, the issue is the economic model that is feasible, that really provides the policymaker with the space that, yes, I'm achieving growth while using the renewable energy or while using this green approach, is something that is happening, and I can do it with almost the same cost of the business as usual. Then you have the shift in thinking. But if you don't have this part, you will have like green growth happens with extra charge. Policymakers look at, okay, I'm staying in power for like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I want to achieve growth, whatever it takes. So I will do it with the least cost. I mean, this is something that we need to take into consideration. That's why we are always saying, bring the initiatives in. So to give the assurance for policymakers, not the negotiators, for the policymakers that things are there and it's going to happen and everybody is on the same track.
Thank you, Mohamed. Pascal, the EU, where do we stand? I mean, after the vote on the Brexit, is the same momentum, the same union inside the the delegation there? Are there any points of contention among member states? EU has always shown some leadership in climate change negotiation. Do you feel the same amount of enthusiasm, or are things slightly changing?
I think the EU, I mean, for those who don't know exactly how it works, in Marrakesh, we've got one chief negotiator, it's Commissioner Arias Cañete, Commissioner for Climate and Energy. And locally, we've got, it's the first week, senior officials and the second week ministers from the different countries who meet every morning to agree on specific elements that need to be discussed and agreed upon this very day. All that is a fruit of month and month of discussion. We've got a position paper with our common position. So ahead of Marrakesh, we came with our EU-wide policy with all the members. Of course, when you say EU-wide, you've got some compromise to be made between certain propositions, but the EU is a remarkable machine to create consensus on this, and probably the area of climate change is one of the most consensual with the EU. Of course, you will always find some differing positions, including on some very important issues like how soon or how much should we raise our own ambition in terms of upgrading our INDC, for instance. And it's no mystery that within the EU, we are not all on the same lines. Mohamed was mentioning the Adaptation Fund, and we probably will go back to that. We all agree that it's a very good fund. And by the way, the EU member states fund it at above 90%, because it's initially a fund that was created under Kyoto Protocol that was supposed to receive proceedings from the Clean Development Mechanism. There are no more or almost no more. So it's a fund basically entirely funded by the EU. So of course we support this fund. We find it has a lot of interest, but we were hesitating. There were different positions as whether or not we should decide in Marrakesh or next year for this fund to serve the Paris Agreement. It was not a question of substance. We all agree it's a very good fund. Otherwise, we would not fund it. It would be dead without us. But we had these discussions on whether or not to agree in Marrakesh on that. And Mohamed followed that discussion more closely than I. It was difficult, but in the end, we decided not to decide in Marrakesh.
Thank you. Merlyn, the Adaptation Fund, I know you have been working on this. Would you like to say something?
Nothing much that Pascal mentioned, except the history, as many of you know, when this Adaptation Fund was negotiated in Warsaw in Poland, I recall, it was very intense negotiations. So there is still a sense, I think, on the side of developing countries that the issue of this Adaptation Fund needs to be given extra attention, but more importantly, it needs to serve the Paris Agreement. And the reason for that, they argue, is that adaptation finance needs to be given exactly the same priority as finance for mitigation efforts. So that really is also part of the bigger political issue, I believe, for developing countries.
Thank you. Now, one issue that has been raised in the press, we've heard about, what are the United States going to do? But I would like to ask you, as a lawyer, what can they do, actually?
Well, it depends. It depends on. I mean, if you want the legal answer, I can give you the legal answer, and then there is a political answer, which is much more important, probably. But the legal answer is that there is an article in the Paris Agreement that says that in order to terminate or to withdraw from the agreement, the country has to wait 3 years from the entry into force, basically the 4th of November, and then through an act terminate or withdraw from the treaty, and that withdrawal takes effect after 1 year. So basically, if the first act in office of Donald Trump is to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, it would have to be, that would go to 2020, 2021. The effect would probably, that decision would take effect, technically, at the time where he's either re-elected or not. So that's how was I mean, that's how it is structured. Of course, there is a tiny paragraph, paragraph 3 of that article, Article 28, that says that a country which is not a party to the convention cannot be a party to the Paris Agreement. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that the convention has a very similar clause, it's Article 25, but the 3 years have already elapsed. So in the case of the convention, the United States could simply withdraw and wait for a year, and that would take effect according to one interpretation. I don't think that interpretation is consistent with the spirit of Article 28. I think that in all events that sort of withdrawal declaration would have the same effect as in paragraph 1 of that article, so basically you need to wait 4 years. Now, this said, is that really an issue? Well, politically, I think things will depend much more upon what are the implications of withdrawing. I mean, if you withdraw from the convention, you may only remain as an observer in the conference of the parties of the convention, right? Now, that's a possibility. You will have less influence to shape the rulebook of the Paris Agreement as well. You have less influence. Of course, you may have influence. The United States are observers in a number of major environmental agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and so on. But that is something to be taken into account when you're going to say, well, should we get out or not? And what are the implications? The second implication is again, what if they stay in? Well, even if they stay in legally, and the obligations technically of mitigation of the United States depend on the United States. And the entire agreement, the entire Paris Agreement, was shaped and written in great, great detail. It was a major sort of mediatic fuss about the drafting of should or shall in Article 4.4 of the Paris Agreement. But basically, it was all built and written in a way that it does not itself create commitments that are binding as a result of the agreement. Whatever is binding and is written in the Paris Agreement is not binding because of the Paris Agreement, but is binding either because there is a domestic law in the United States that makes it binding, or potentially because of the convention.
Thank you. I would like to leave a little bit of time for the questions. So before we move on to the Q&A, could each of you give me like one word or one concept that would represent for you the future of the climate change negotiation? Who wants to start? Pascal?
I can start if you want. I would probably say two concepts. The first one is what political scientists call the complex, the regime complex, complex regime, regime complex. It was already a combination of several pieces in movement, for like Montreal Protocol, of course the UNFCCC, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization negotiation to reduce greenhouse effects emissions and all of that. So we already had a combination of several legal pillars to what is an overall climate regime. Now it's even more complicated because, as we said, it's really a regime shared by non-state actors, and we have to invent the way these different parts connect with one another. And I heard the concern from Mohamed to see how these non-state actors will be, in a way, accountable for the pledges, for instance. This is a whole new world that we need to address, a new way to combine parties, so government, the traditional way of doing international politics, with these new actors. So for me, I would probably say that would be the concept and the challenge for the years to come. But for the sake of time, I would probably stay with this one.
Mohamed, you want to have a try?
Now keep me to the last. Let me be the last one to comment on that. Merlyn, please go ahead first.
Sure. I think the future of the climate negotiations can be captured in one phrase: there is no turning back. Secondly, I think that the movement towards change is not just evident in the climate landscape, We must remember the Kigali Amendment to phase down HFCs, which is extremely important. The other thing we must remember, which is why there's no turning back, is the agreement that was achieved by the aviation industry. Yes, there's still they've taken a long view, but I think all of the things point in this one direction. There's no turning back.
Thank you. Mohamed?
So it's me again. Well, I would say is that for the negotiations to move forward and to achieve the goal is that we have to have a balanced ambition and everything. So if we are very ambitious in our mitigation commitments or mitigation approaches, we have to have the same ambition in adaptation and mainly in means of implementation, because at a certain point, countries will work with their own resources as reflected in the part of the NDCs. But the scaling up of the support from whatever source it is, this is the only, I think that would be this would be very crucial to ensure that we are on track for the 2 degrees or the 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, we will be stopping halfway. We'll just do whatever we can, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll go back to this polarization of discussion, blame game, or I have not been supported, I can be supported. Especially that the Paris Agreement is a bottom-up approach. It is not a top-down. Unless there is a change in views after the first global stock take or by 2023 to shift from a bottom-up to top-down, if the ambition is not very high. So ambition is a key. Transformational change in thinking has already happened in all countries, including developing countries. But how to keep it running on the same pace, this is the challenge that we'll be facing.
Thank you, Mohamed. Okay.
Yeah, I think I will just not add much, but there is indeed no turning back. The direction is very clear. What is not clear is the pace. And the pace is a key thing for investment, unfortunately. So, I mean, people don't invest on this unless they have some idea of what the pace is going to be, what game are they going to play, not just, the next few years, but they need a clear idea of what the game is going to be, at least in the next 30 years. So that is where we have to strengthen the message. The message that we're going in that direction that was once at stake is no longer at stake, is no longer questioned. Even in the United States, despite the fact that we may need 10 more years for the population to actually get the message, or half of the population to get the message. So the direction is clear, but the pace is not clear yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I propose we turn towards the question. We have one on the compliance of the pledge. I think it has been answered during the discussion. Another one is, to what extent do the panelists feel that existing methodologies such as those used for technology needs assessment can be used for NDC formulation in developing countries? Anyone willing to answer? It's a very technical question. Do we have any experts in the room on this one?
If I may, I mean, needs assessment is a crucial element because it's very much similar to the NDCs, but with the difference that NDCs is that what you are planning to do. But needs assessment, out of the experience of that we had in Egypt, highlights what is your potential. So it is beyond what you can do. It's like, what potential do you have? And in that, it is very important. I mean, you can have like assessment of the needs in technology, needs in finance, for adaptation and for mitigation. But in doing the process of the needs assessment, you also, by de facto, analyze what do you have, what exactly do you want to have, and what your potential is. And I think this is a crucial element. So existing mechanisms, they are not as accurate, and they are not. They are not very much in the process. There is some needs assessment. There is NAPS under the GCF, which is National Adaptation Planning. So we are on the track, but again, like on other things, we are not as fast as we should be. But I think it's very good. The needs assessments in general is very good.
Thank you. We have another pretty technical question: is whether there were discussions on how to use some of the UNFCCC and KP mechanisms and rules in the rule book of the Paris Agreement. But that, I mean, more generally, that raises the question of the relation between the convention and the Paris Agreement. Any of you want to have a take on this one? Yes, Pascal?
Maybe a few words on that, because it's, and Mohamed alluded to that earlier on, one of the kind of fault lines that existed before Paris was basically this difference between the countries that were on different annexes in the 1992 and the Kyoto Protocol. And so under the Kyoto Protocol, you've got different processes, for instance, on transparency, who should report, how often, which level of detail, that are totally different for countries that are on one annex or the others. Annexes were built now 25 years ago. And for instance, if you look at the current EU, we've got a lot of countries that are much poorer than countries that are supposed to be in the old list developing countries like Singapore and others. So a lot of discussion on transparency, but also on finance, on a lot of things, has to do with this complex relationship we've got with the old annexes. And so when people say Kyoto Protocol principles, it's often a coded language for annexes. So it's clearly, if I take the EU position, I think for us, Paris has changed the game. We still have concept of developed and developing countries, but we don't wish to refer to 25-year-old annexes that for us are not at all reflecting the current situation.
I see Mohamed smiling. We have a take on that.
Of course, I mean, yes, the issue is also, it's not only related to climate change. I mean, and Professor Jorge would know that in the WTO also you have this attempt to shift to the SVEs, to have more focus on the small and vulnerable economies rather than saying developing countries in general. The problem that we face is the issue of differentiation. How can we reflect differentiation, taking into consideration the new realities? And in that, differentiation is not only like what level, like your financial capabilities, but also what level of development have you reached. So in many cases, it is a development discussion rather than climate or economy. It's more of a development discussion. And here, like, I'm sure that we have a lot of that we had already in Marrakesh. This discussion was very much core of the finance, be it seen or underlying. But I'm sure in the coming couple have the same discussion. It is not about what we report or how we report it. You have common time frames. You have most probably will have like the same transparency mechanisms. But the thing is, like, what flexibilities do you give for countries? And do you confine them only to the LDCs and SIDS? By the way, Singapore is SIDS, so they get the flexibility anyway. Or you expand it to developing countries, that is, and how you define developing countries. A discussion that we had on Turkey case was Turkey pushing for new definition or developing countries that is within the World Bank, while other countries, all the G77 in general, was saying that we stick to our definition of Annex 1, non-Annex 1, without saying it, but let's keep that as in the back of our thinking. We should not shift from a current like definition of who are the ones to be supported, who are the ones who need support, to another definition that is adopted somewhere else. Otherwise, it opens Pandora's box, because it will unravel too many decisions that already has been taken regarding the transparency. So it is better to keep this Pandora's box closed and not go there. Otherwise, it will really have an impact on the rest of the negotiations, wherever it is. I think so.
Okay.
Just if I may add a much broader perspective. So there are actually two questions that share a common core, which is to what extent what is already there is going to be used to some extent in the Paris Agreement movement. And I think that much of it will be used in some way. And I give you two examples. The Adaptation Fund, we're still discussing, of course, but the Adaptation Fund is linked to the CDM because it is fed partly through one of the mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, and by moving the Adaptation Fund into the Paris Agreement, there is also, I would say, that implies to a significant extent that much of this, the CDM, which is a mechanism, a market mechanism within the Kyoto Protocol, is going to provide the backbone of the mechanism for sustainable development mechanism. Of course, there are fundamental differences, and there is one fundamental difference. In the Paris Agreement, there is no longer this distinction for the operation of the sustainable development mechanism between an Annex 1 and an Annex 1 country. So it's the mechanism on sustainable development in Article 6, I think, of the Paris Agreement is going to be much more of a sort of combination of the joint development, joint implementation mechanism and the clean development mechanism. But the rules, the accreditation approach, etc., and much of that, the staff at the Secretariat, I mean, a number of issues are going to be transposed to the Paris Agreement. There is an effort to salvage much of the experience that that has been developed under the Kyoto Protocol. It would be really too bad. I would even say it would be stupid not to rely on something that took so much effort, so much time, so much investment to develop.
Thank you, Jorge.
2 years to finalize this rule book, so we need to draw the lessons from what exists already.
Right, of course.
That indeed.
So we have one question on the outcomes of the COP. So were there any concrete decisions related to agriculture? And also it appears that most of the concrete decisions taken at COP22 were to wait, continue work, and make those decisions next year, or in 2018. Would you agree with this statement?
Who should start?
Okay, Pascal, please.
So, in very simple terms, no decision on agriculture specifically. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. I just read them all yesterday, but I didn't see any specific point. I mean, the place for agriculture, one major place for agriculture in the Paris Agreement is Article 5, which is about land use change. And that is going to be a development of that Article 5 mechanism, or mechanisms, is going to be part of the rule. So not at that point. Is the assessment correct? And I mean, I'm going to read the assessment and tell you. So also it appears that most of the concrete decisions taken at COP22 were to wait and continue work and make those decisions next year. Well, I mean, I don't think it's an entirely correct assessment, because much was done, it simply was not adopted as part of the rule book. So I think that there is a lot of work being ongoing work, although it is not in polished form, ready to be presented to a plenary and be adopted as a decision.
Thank you, Jorge. Back on the potential US withdrawal, one other participant is asking what is the current position of Canada, which withdrew from Kyoto Protocol in 2011.
Well, it's an easy one, this one. And I remember at the pre-COP before Paris, when Minister McDonnell first came to Paris, she got a big round of applause with a very simple sentence: Canada is back. So I think Canada is back and the US are probably getting out.
Thank you. Another one on what about flexible mechanism successors to the CDM?
Yeah. I was just mentioning that actually you do have in the Paris Agreement, if you look at Articles 4 to 6, in the Paris Agreement, you have a number of flexible mechanisms. You have the possibility of a bubble, a sort of European bubble. You have something very close to what used to be the joint implementation on CDM, that is Article 6 is called, it's not called, it used to be called in a previous version of the draft of the Paris Agreement, a sustainable development mechanism. It has no name, but it's very similar. It's an offsetting mechanism. You have also a mechanism very similar to what was a flexible mechanism in Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol, international emissions trading, and that is now called, because there is no longer a cap, I mean, there is no longer a cap, a sort of an international cap on emissions. Now that is called ITMOS. It looks like the Gremlins movie. It's like ITMOS is internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Basically, is if you develop a project in California and in some place in Canada, in Quebec, for instance, they accept that an emission accredited as a proper emission reduction in California is to be also accepted in Quebec. Well, the Paris Agreement provides a platform to say, well, that can be used, but it's not requiring anyone to do this linking, so that is to accept the credits from other systems. But yes, there are plenty of market mechanisms. There are also non-market mechanisms.
Yeah, those are very important for some countries, the non-market mechanisms.
Yeah.
It's part of the debate that was, wherever you have a paragraph on forests, the non-market-based mechanisms was always like present. Some countries were very keen on seeing them, and they have a point. I mean, and when we were discussing that when I was a student, then I had my own point of view. I'm not in favor of the financialization of natural resources. This is my point of view, but because it leads to like it's a business-oriented thing, and then we have a lot of different approaches. It's not about the environment; it becomes more of an economic business thing. So I mean, some countries still believe in that. In the high level panel on climate finance, part of the discussion was how can we mobilize or leverage finance, and carbon pricing was like the headline, be it upfront or in the back, but that was the headline. All the mechanisms that are in place or will be established, I believe they will be in effect like in the coming 2 to 3 years. But then the question will be like, okay, so how can we ensure that there will be some shares going to specific entities rather than like the EU ETS, for example, the money was, or like what was raised went to the governments, and the governments decided what to do with that. But on the Kyoto Protocol, you had the shares of proceeds going to the Adaptation Fund from the mechanisms. It was more of a solidarity fund because those shares of proceeds comes from developing country CERs. So I believe that part of the discussion on the Adaptation Fund was related to if we move it or if we expand it to serve the Paris Agreement, how are we going to solve the issue of the shares of proceeds? Especially that we haven't finished the discussions on the markets yet. So most probably it will happen after the markets discussion is matured and things are very clear that then the Adaptation Fund will fit in with a mechanism to ensure resources to the Adaptation Fund. Maybe. I mean, this might be one way to look at it. So.
Okay, fine. Maybe one last one for you, Merlyn. Somebody is asking how to accelerate the pace and what triggers the reaction of the member states so that they move forward faster. As an external, I mean, looking at member states in general, what would be your take on this one? What triggers member states' action?
I think what triggers member states' action is the obvious one, which is political will. We have seen this in countries from Canada to Ethiopia. If you have strong political will, you can have policies that can actually make domestic actions with respect to mitigation happen. So, for example, in our work with countries, we have just started looking at how we can support developing countries who want to include or develop new legislation from a climate perspective to allow them to do the things that they said they want to do in their nationally determined contributions. So I think we often in our discussions, yes, we need concrete steps, but we forget that policy and legislation is also an important part of the puzzle. because that is what makes us, we are all citizens in different jurisdictions. That is what actually determines our behavior, if you like, how we act. And so I think one key element to repeat is the political will, and then that political will, we have to see evidence of it in the relevant policies and domestic legislation.
Thank you very much, Merlyn. You want to add something, Pascal?
Yeah, I wanted just to concur with Merlyn that, of course, political will and legal framework are extremely important, but they have to be seen as enabler also for non-state actors' action to give the right signal, market signal, policy stability, because we are thinking of trillions of investment, very far from the few billions that every country could eventually receive in support. So it's changing the whole paradigm. You need countries to have the right legal framework and leave their investors the possibility to follow these signals that are coming from the UNFCCC intergovernmental negotiations. So I think it's a complementarity between signal that we get from the intergovernmental negotiation and private and non-state actors' decisions. It's really what will move us from the billions to the trillions that we need.
Thank you, Pascal. A concluding remark?
Okay. Just to basically restate what has already been said, I would probably add that climate change action, actual action, is going to be, for good or for worse, about investment. And very quickly we're going to start to realize that the Paris Agreement is just one piece of the puzzle, which is far broader. And we have to think more closely about investment law. This is something that only started to be looked at very shyly in the Sustainable Development Goals and in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In the outcome document of Rio +20, there is no single reference to investment law. There are references to private investment, but no single reference to investment law. And if you look at the practice of investment law, this is booming. Booming, I mean, the amount of cases brought every week with environmental components is increasing dramatically. And there are, in the last 3 years or 4 years, there have been more cases than any time before on those issues. And this is going to stay booming. So we have to think about how to integrate climate change in free trade and investment agreements.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Thank you to all our panelists for this very interesting discussion. There would certainly be a lot more to say, but we said we would take 1 hour of your time, so we are going to stop here. If you want to know more about what the Institute is doing in the field of environmental governance, you can look it up on our website, graduateinstitute.ch/environment. I wish you all a very good end of the day, and hope to see you soon at the Institute. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.